So I'm here today to talk to you about mudlarking. Now, there are probably a few of you that might know what it is, but a vast majority of you won't know what it is. I go down onto the banks of the River Thames, and I look for lost and forgotten objects. And this is me doing what I love. Covered in mud, freezing cold, out on the Thames estuary, and I'm holding a complete Iron Age pot that I've just found lying on top of the foreshore. Now, my descent into this kind of state was quite a gradual one. I moved to London soon after I finished university at Newcastle, and I was looking for some peace amid the chaos of the city. So it was peace that led me down to the river. And for the longest time, I searched for peace in the parks. London's got some incredible parks, but I just couldn't find it there. They were too manicured, there were too many people. And then one day I found myself down on the river, and it really is, it's a streak of wilderness that cuts through the center of our capital city. And it's strange because people don't see it. If you live in London, the river's something that maybe you travel over to get from North and South London. It's an irritation when you can't get across the bridges. You just don't see it. And I ended up going down there, and it is a beautiful place. And for years, I walked along the banks, and I just enjoyed it from the river path. And then one day, about 15 years ago, I found myself at the top of a rickety set of wooden stairs, and it was low tide. And I went down onto the foreshore. And there again, the foreshore is somewhere that people who live in London think you can't go down there. It's some kind of forbidden area. And it hadn't occurred to me that I could go down there. And I did. And I went down and I found a simple piece of clay pipe. And it sparked my imagination. And I went back and I found more things. And I went back again and I found even more things. And soon I was completely obsessed with going down to this magical place that was 1,000,000 miles away from the chaos of the city around me. And I was spending hours down there. And pretty soon I realized that there was more to it than peace and solitude. It was a place where history became real. The things that I was finding were just the ordinary possessions of everyday people, the sort of people who had been forgotten by history. All that they'd left was their belongings and these objects that I was finding washing up on the river. Now, I'm not a treasure hunter. I'm not an archaeologist or a historian. I'm probably best described as someone who is archaeologically curious. I'm never going to get rich from mudlarking. I'm lucky, it's my hobby. This poor person, this is Peggy Jones. Now, Peggy Jones, she had to mudlark to make a living. She lived back in 1820, and her patch was Blackfriars, and she would wade in up to her waist, looking for coal that she could sell to get lodgings for the night. And this is how Peggy Jones lived. She was an original mudlark. And she was one of many, mainly women, children, old people, the lowest of the low, the poorest of the poor. The only way these people could keep themselves out of the workhouses was to go down and look for rags and bone and rope and really anything they could sell. If they were lucky, they might find a copper nail. Anything they could sell to make enough money to keep themselves off the streets and put some food in their bellies. And the fact that going down and wading through what would have been just revolting back then, because the river was just a moving cesspit, the fact that they would go down and do that rather than go into the workhouse says something about how horrific that the workhouses were at the time. And she was one of many hundreds of people, armies of mudlarks that would go down to the river to search through the filth at low tide. And it's the tides that make the Thames unique. You could theoretically mudlark on any river, but in London, the tides fall so low that twice every 24 hours you can get down onto the riverbed to search it. So it's the tides and 2,000 years of intense habitation that makes it the unique place it is. And this is the foreshore in central London. The posts you can see are the remains of Victorian revetments. So how did all this stuff get into the river? So A lot of it was lost and dropped by the people who lived and worked and travelled on the river. The river was a very important highway for a long time. People dropped things as they got in and out of wherries, as they travelled across the old bridge. They threw things in. It was a very convenient dump. It still is. And all these objects settled down into the river. But most of the objects that I find actually come out of the foreshore itself. Until the 1960s, the foreshore was a working environment. It's where the barges would come up, and people would pour domestic waste into the foreshore behind these revetments and pack it down and create these flat barge beds for the barges to sit on at low tide. Now, after the 1960s, the barges and the ships stopped coming up to London, and the foreshore was forgotten. And the river is now eating away into all this rubbish and dispersing its contents across the foreshore. And so it's a mixed up muddle of history. It's why I find medieval coins rubbing shoulders with Victorian bottles and 18th century musket balls side by side with Roman pottery. And I approach it in a very philosophical way. I don't use a metal detector, I don't dig, and I don't scrape. I only take what the river chooses to leave for me. And I go out and I search eyes only, looking for anything that's been left by the tide. And every tide uncovers something different in this giant, beautiful history book. And I never know what I'm going to find next. And here are some of the things that I found. So obviously the oldest things that you find are fossils. They tell the story of the river itself when it was a warm sea. It's an incredible preserver. The combs at the top, those are 16th century combs. They're made of wood, and they've been perfectly preserved in the mud because the mud is anaerobic. It means there's no oxygen in there. So anything that drops into the mud is as perfectly preserved as the day it was lost. The little shoe in the middle is a Tudor child's shoe, and I pulled it out pretty much like that, perfectly preserved. It's got the little creases across the top, and inside I could see just the faint shadow of the original owner's foot. Holding something like that is incredible. It's the closest thing I can think of to time travel. It's like reaching back through history, and actually shaking hands with the people who owned it, because I was the first person to pick that up. In 500 years, the first person to actually touch it since its owner lost it. You find, when you're searching really close up, you find the tiniest things. There's a little tiny bone die, Roman bone die. There's a tiny intaglio that's dropped out of a Roman's ring with the figure of Bonus Eventus on it. And the smallest things are beads. This is a little, I think this is a little semi-precious stone bead. But you find the tiny beads that they took off to new countries to trade with, the tiny seed beads they took to North America to trade with the Native Americans out there. The tile at the bottom has got a wooden peg in it. It's a medieval tile. The tile survived, but so is the wooden peg, which is incredible. And then, of course, there are little tiny bone Roman game counters, nearly enough to play a game. The most common things is pottery. There's pottery down on the foreshore that tells the story of the city from prehistory through to IKEA plates. You're guaranteed to find pottery. Another thing you're guaranteed to find are clay pipe stems. I can honestly say to you, if you went down there tomorrow, you would find at least a piece of clay pipe stem. If you're lucky, you'll find one of the tiny bowls. The tiniest ones are no bigger than the end of my little finger, and they date to around 1580 when Walter Raleigh first brought tobacco back from the New World. And it was expensive, but it soon caught on, and soon everybody was smoking. And the streets were thick with these little tiny pipe bowls. And they were dumped on the foreshore and thrown out of taverns and dropped off wherries. And that's why there's so many of them. There's so many. And it amazes me that the river is so gentle with them, because you find them in perfect condition. Just like glass, this is a 17th century apothecary glass. And this little piece of glass in the corner, the museum thought it was Roman. It's actually medieval Islamic glass, which is very rare. You find the weirdest things on the foreshore. There is a colony of seahorses out on the Isle of Dogs, and for a while, dead ones were washing up. I found this one outside the Globe. Don't judge me, but I collect human teeth. I've got quite a few of them, but I can't stand the dentures. These ones date from around the 1950s. When I saw that eye staring back at me from the foreshore, I nearly wet myself. It was terrifying. It was like seeing Father Thames staring back at me himself. It's a glass eye. It's beautiful. It's handmade. Even the little tiny blood vessels in it. I don't know how old it is. I do know that they made a huge amount of them after the First World War when a lot of people had their eyes damaged. A huge barnacle from the Pacific. That's come all the way from the Pacific. Maybe it was stuck on the bottom of a trade ship. Maybe it was in the ballast they'd put in the belly of the trade ship that was emptied out onto the foreshore. But some of the most poignant things are the children's toys, simply because their little owners have grown up. They've had their own children, and they've moved on to the next life. The chicken and the little pewter dripping pan date right back to the 17th century, and then there's a plastic soldier from the 1970s. Obviously, I report everything, but there are some things that you have to legally report. This chap here, I found a couple of months ago. It's likely that he came from one of the prison ships, so he's around 200 years old. We reburied him, we gathered up what we could because he was spread across quite a bit of the foreshore. We gathered him up, we took a GPS setting and we told the police, and he's now in the coroner's office. Given that he's nearly 200 years old, I was quite surprised to find a policeman on my doorstep asking for my DNA to rule me out of anything suspicious. But there we go. Anything that's been involved in a crime. This is the barrel of a gun. It's had the handle and the barrel shot off, but it's still got the bullets in it. Treasure. These are gold. This is Tudor gold. Anything made of precious metal over 300 years old legally has to be reported. And there's a lot of live bombs and ammunition in the river. The river was a soft landing during the Blitz, and you do come across bombs. They have to be reported. Don't take them home on the train like I did with one of them. That wasn't such a good idea. So I've shown you some of the river's rich trove, piqued your interest, I hope, and you might be asking the same question that I ask myself all the time as I'm staring for 5 to 6 hours at the same tiny patch of foreshore. What of us are we leaving behind for future generations of mudlarks? And the answer is really sad. It's plastic. The river now is cleaner than it's ever been in living memory, which isn't saying much. In the 1950s, it was declared biologically dead. There wasn't a single living creature between Kew and Gravesend. But it is clean, but it still carries a heavy load. Out on the estuary, the floating rubbish gathers in these multicolored banks. And in Hammersmith, wet wipes are creating islands. Our rubbish is actually changing the geography of the river itself in a way that our ancestors' rubbish never did. The things that our ancestors threw away were made of bone and leather and glass and clay, and that will break down harmlessly and return to where it came from. What we're leaving behind is eternal. Thank you.